Today on Carcass, we have a special delivery in the shop as we start a new project with a specific purpose.
We'll pull the body off and strip down the frame to prepare for upgraded suspension.
Then head out to a salvage yard in search for some heavy-duty axles.
And show you what to look for when selecting a set of 1-tons for your next project.
You guys are probably wondering, why do we have 3 vehicles in the shop today? You're probably more curious is, why do we have 3 retired U.S. Postal Jeeps in the shop today? Well, there's a big story behind these trucks, and that all started when Jimmy and I were looking for a right-hand drive vehicle. We thought to ourselves, what's the most readily available right-hand drive vehicle in America? Well, that's the U.S. Postal Jeep.
The lady we bought these Jeeps from is a retired postal worker, and she drove each of these things into the ground.
But the only way we could get one Jeep was to buy all 3. So we shook hands and started loading them up. The white one has seen better days, but maybe we can scavenge a couple parts off of it.
The seafoam one is in pretty good shape, but it wouldn't run, so we had to pull it to the trailer.
The yellow one seemed to be our best candidate. It was in decent shape and it fired right up. This thing runs really good. And it's the weirdest thing to be on this side.
We managed to get all 3 of these Jeeps loaded up and back to the shop in one day. And now that they're all here, we need to talk about what the end goal is with one of them.
And that first starts with us trying to decide which one of these we're going to build. My vote's on the yellow one because that one runs.
See, I think the seafoam green one because I think the chassis and body are a little better, and even though the 4-cylinder is in this one, we should be able to put the 6-cylinder in it.
Yep, that's a good point. Well, that pretty much decides it then. But what are we gonna do to the green Jeep? We're dumping the wheels, the axles, and the leaf spring suspension. We'll be replacing that with a 4-link setup all the way around. We'll swap out the stock transmission for a setup out of a TJ. And when we're done with that, we'll slap on a bigger set of wheels and tires, bringing Project Junk Mail to life. Now, you've probably gathered by now that we're gonna be building a 4-wheel drive off-road rig. Now, Jeeps are known for their off-road capabilities, and to keep with that Jeep tradition, we're going to be taking our 2-wheel drive Jeep and converting it to 4-wheel drive.
And the seafoam green Jeep is going to be the Jeep of choice for this build because it has the least amount of rust, dents, and we're hoping it's going to come apart the easiest. But we're going to keep the yellow Jeep around just in case we need some extra parts, and the white Jeep is probably going to end up going to the scrapyard because the body has a lot of rust holes in it. There aren't too many good panels on it, and we really just don't need any of that.
And we got a killer deal on all 3 of these Jeeps. We basically got all 3 of them for the price of one. So with this build, we're gonna spend some money where it makes sense, but we're also gonna build and fabricate what we can.
And that makes a lot of sense in our shop because we have a ton of capability here, which gives us the opportunity to show you guys how to build things like a 4-link suspension. But as you said, we're gonna spend the money where it really matters, like on a really good set of coilovers.
And we're also gonna go out and get a set of Junkyard axles. But we're gonna spend some money on the internals of those axles because we're gonna show you guys how to make them handle a bigger set of tires. But before we can get started on the green Jeep, we gotta get the other 2 out of the shop.
We'll pull the 6-cylinder from the yellow Jeep so it can go down to engine power for some upgrades. And that means a little more power to help us out on the trail.
You know, Jimmy, the meat and potatoes of this build are all the way down at the chassis, but before we get there, we have to get rid of this body.
Yeah, let's drain the radiator so we can get the grill off and everything, and also take the whole front clip off.
Yeah, but I think first the hood goes.
Yeah, I'll get some tools.
Holy cow, that's green. You could probably reuse that. Well, not the end there, though. Random thing when I take apart cars and trucks, I keep the hose clamps.
Yeah, I do too. You know, unless you break them, they're not really going bad.
Yeah, you just stash them away for a rainy day.
It's a good thing we're keeping those other Jeeps because this thing's kind of falling apart.
Junk. This literally is gonna break apart before I can get it out of here. Or I may have to break it apart. Oh, and it's hooked up yet. Yeah, we don't need that. I'll push back in here. Oh wait, maybe I can just pull it straight. Oh, take the whole fender.
Y'all good?
Yeah, I'm good. Well, now that we have the front clip out of the way, it's time to remove the rest of the body from the chassis. And as I pulled the fender out, I noticed something. Deep down inside here, somebody has welded the steering shaft to the U-joint that connects to the column. Now, normally this piece is something that just slides out. But, well, somebody welded it. So for us to get the body off the chassis, we're just gonna cut it because you know what? We're not using any of this stuff anyways.
Y'all loose over there?
Yeah, I'm free. You free?
Yeah, start pushing.
Yeah, we'll get it onto the hoist. Make that thing do all the heavy lifting.
You know, it's about to go down.
No, it's gonna go up, Jimmy. It's going up.
Well, the project is about to go down.
Right, right.
It may have been good for delivering the mail, but for our plans, it all has to go.
We start tearing into junk mail's chassis, getting rid of the old leaf springs and making room for some upgraded suspension.
Y'all clear?
Yeah, that's plenty high right there. Now the body came off of the frame pretty easy, but we still got a bunch of stuff that we have to do before we can start having some fun.
We have to tear out the engine and we have to get the chassis completely stripped of the old suspension to get ready for the new stuff.
Yeah, and we're not gonna do that here, so we're gonna roll this thing out of the way, get it out into the open, and start cutting it up. 2 horsepower, Jimmy. 2 horsepower now. This is hands down the easiest way to pull this. Oop, just like that.
That's state of the art.
That's easy way.
Now that we have the engine and transmission out of the way, it's time to get rid of the old suspension too.
There's many different ways we could go about doing that. If we were gonna keep the suspension, we could grab wrenches and unbolt everything. Or if we were being a little less cautious, we could grab a cutoff wheel and cut that way. But we're not interested in keeping any of this stuff, and we just want it out from underneath here as fast as possible. So the torch is gonna be our choice.
Don't take too long.
It won't, trust me. With our trusty torch, we can throw caution to the wind and start cutting some metal. The plan here is to keep most of the suspension intact. So when we get ready to get rid of it, we can just roll it right out of the way. We'll also cut through the drag link and unbolt our shocks. There it goes, yeah! Now the front, well, that came out pretty easy, but here in the back, we're gonna take a little different approach. The bracket that holds on the leaf spring is riveted on, versus in the front, it was welded. So what I'm gonna do is take the torch, and I'm gonna knock the tops of the rivets off. And then I'll come back with a hammer and just drive them out. We gotta clean the chassis up anyways and get rid of all the brackets, so this is just gonna save us a bunch of time.
While he's finishing up in the back, I'm gonna get started removing the front bumper, starting with a few rivets. And the rest will just unbolt.
Whew. Ta-da.
Awesome.
Now, while I was using the torch to get rid of the rivets, I noticed one thing. On the corner of the brackets, they also welded these to the chassis. So I'm gonna use a cutoff wheel, score a little line right down here on the edge, and hopefully we'll be able to pound those brackets off. With our welds cut, our air hammer makes quick work of our brackets. While we're at it, we'll go ahead and take care of the rivets that hold on the rear bumper. There it goes.
This chassis is a really good place to start, but we're about to be missing something.
What's that?
Set of axles.
Yeah, you know what? I know a guy, but it's gonna require us getting out of the shop.
Today is the day that we're going to find a set of axles for Project Junk Mail, and we've narrowed it down to basically two options. Dana 60s from either a Ford or a Dodge pickup. But there's one major issue with the Dana 60s from the Dodge pickups. They have this thing called a CAD, or center axle disconnect. What this means is the axle shaft is in two pieces and there's a big hole in the axle housing itself, which can cause the axle to be weaker. We don't really want to deal with potential issues when we're out on the trail, so we're going to go with Ford axles.
So we were talking to our friend next door, Mr. Tommy Boschers, and he gave us a lead on a Ford Picker's Paradise. So we're headed down to Butler's Garage. Now Ford came out with a couple different axles underneath their Super Duties over the years, so we're going to help show you guys the differences between those axles. And we just want to come home with the right set of axles for Project Junk Mail. Reason why we're doing a 60 versus a 44 is basically on tire size. So we can run a Dana 44 all the way up to like the 37-inch tall tire mark, and that's going to be pretty much the extent of what you can put on that 44 just from all the internals and the axle shafts and stuff like that. So if we go with the Dana 60, we're obviously there already, so we can go with a 37 and you can just go up from there. You know, Project Junk Mail really isn't going to be this extreme rock crawler or this rock bouncer by any means, or thrash in the hills. What it's really going to be is just a good all-around trail truck. We will probably get into a little bit of rock, but not much. It's basically just going to be a good truck to get us up and down the trails. You could probably even use it on a farm if you want to haul stuff with it. I mean, there's not a ton of room, but I think it'll be an all-around good build, and Dana 60s are absolutely perfect to put underneath there.
Yeah, I feel like you could just kind of start off with something really good so you can build from there, instead of if you decided to go bigger tires or this or that, you kind of have to start all over.
Right, so we might as well, you know, go to a certain point, start at that point, obviously with Dana 60s, and from there we can always go up, you know, versus if we start with like a Dana 44, which would be fine. If we ever wanted to go with a taller tire, you would definitely have to kind of reinvent the wheel to throw a whole nother set of axles underneath that truck. So I think Dana 60s are a good starting point.
I feel like Dana 60s are just like, no one's gonna give you grief over that.
Yeah. A Dana 60 is just, it's an all-around good axle.
Yeah.
I mean, they came underneath so many different things.
Yeah.
Chevy ran Dana 60s in their 1-tons. Ford runs them in their 1-tons. Dodge runs them in their 1-tons. It's just a good all-around builder. Parts are extremely available for them. We can just take the one out of that truck. Now here in the row of axles, you've got many different options. And underneath the Super Duty, you had two. You either had the Dana 50 or the Dana 60. They both look very similar, and we're gonna show you the differences between the two. So I'm gonna go look for a Dana 50.
And I'll try to sort through this, find us a Dana 60.
Now there's a couple visual ways you can tell that you're looking at a Dana 50. First is there's a very abrupt kick up in the casting. On the Dana 60, it's a little more gradual. And the second is right here on the pinion. This one's got a little bit smaller nut than the Dana 60. That measures in at 1 1/8 inches.
Like Jeremy said, on the Dana 60s, the slope in the casting is a little bit more gradual and the pinion nut is a little bit bigger at 1 5/16 inches. And throughout the years, Ford used a couple different styles of suspension. On their newer trucks, they used the radius arm style suspension where they had the bracketry on one side cast into the housing, and on the other side, it was welded to the axle tube. That's gonna take a lot of time and effort on our end to cut it off and get it ready for our 4-link suspension. But on the older trucks, all they had was a couple spring perches that are easy to cut off and get ready for our new suspension.
And another thing to pay attention to on the rear axle of these trucks is the way that they attach the drive shaft. On the newer series trucks, they ran a pinion flange. And on the older models, they ran a pinion yoke. And that's what we're after.
Looks like you found us a rear axle.
Yeah, I think we're gonna take one of these two for the rear, and I'm pretty sure he's got a front one waiting for us.
All right, I'll check these out, see which one's a little bit cleaner, and I'll meet you up there.
Sounds good. Now, one more plus side to running a Super Duty axle versus a Dodge axle is that the Super Duty axles have a set of lockouts. That means we can either disconnect one or both sides of the axle shafts. Now all we got to do is get this one loaded in the truck.
We've talked about the external differences of a Dana 50 versus a Dana 60, but here's an internal difference. On the Dana 50 axle shafts, you can see it kind of tapers down, versus on the Dana 60, the overall shaft diameter is a lot bigger, which means it's stronger. And the aftermarket support for a Dana 60 is way better.
All right, what do you say we get these things back to the shop because I want to tear into these things?
Yeah, I gotta finish cleaning the rest of the chassis too.
Yeah, our Jeep's getting a set of 1-tons. We have a little more cleaning up to do. We finished prepping our frame and stripping down our heavy-duty axles, getting them ready for our new suspension. With our axles out of the yard and in the shop, we got a lot of work ahead of us. Now we're gonna end up stripping down both of our axles to just bare housings, and we're gonna do that for 2 reasons. 1, we're gonna end up rebuilding both axles pretty much from hub to hub. And 2, we're gonna use just the bare housings to set up the suspension underneath our Jeep. And it's a whole lot easier to move around just a housing than it is a few 100-pound axle assembly.
And while he's finishing up the axles, I'm going to be finishing taking off all the unnecessary brackets on the chassis. We already did it on the top side, so we flipped it over and there's a few things left, like the leaf spring hangers and the bump stops. But that's nothing that an air chisel can't fix. First, I'll remove these bump stops by taking out a few bolts. Now these leaf spring hanger brackets are riveted in, so here's a little trick that I like to use. Using a cutoff wheel, I make an X in the head, which makes it weaker, and that makes quick work for my air chisel. With the brackets out of the way, I'll grind the rivets down and punch the rest out with my air hammer.
While Jimmy's been working on our chassis, I got to take a good look at our front axle, and I noticed a lot of rusted nuts and bolts. So I've been spraying it down with some CRC Power Lube. This stuff is fast acting, it loosens frozen parts, and should make disassembly go a whole lot quicker. With our caliper out of the way, we can take off our rotor, followed by the steering. Then we'll pull out the hub, followed by the C-clips and the washers that hold in the axle. All right, let's see what we got back here. Oh, those should be pretty easy now. Yeah, it's moving. With our hub assemblies and our axle shafts out of the way, it's time to move on and make a little bit of a mess. We're gonna go ahead and pop this diff cover, and I'm gonna pull out the gear set and the pinion. Then we'll move on to cleaning up the rest of this axle. It's a good idea to mark your bearing caps, because when we go back to reassemble, we don't want to make any mistakes. So we're going to mark the left side with 1 mark and the right side with 2. With our bearing caps out of the way, now we can yank out our diff. And with a little persuasion, the pinion comes right out. With the gears out of the way, there's still a couple things I gotta take care of. Gotta cut off the big bracket that held some of the steering on, and I gotta get rid of this spring perch too. Getting rid of these are pretty simple. Just follow the contour of the axle. I like to leave a little bit of the weld and the bracket, so I don't score the axle tube. Then I'll just come back with the grinder and grind it flush. Same principle applies with the perch, and we can easily knock it off with a hammer.
Dude, you made a ton of progress on this today.
Yeah, I got the front axle completely tore down. Still got some grinding to do. Haven't even touched the rear yet, but I'll get to that. How'd the chassis go?
Pretty good. I got everything ground down and just needs a little bit of a wash, but I can't wait till you're done with this so we can start designing the suspension.
Oh yeah, that'll be a whole lot of fun, but we'll get to that later. If you guys like anything you've seen on the show today, why don't you check us out at PowerNationTV.com, and well, we'll see you next time.
You're probably needing this more than I do, right?
Yeah, totally need to start grinding. But safety glasses first, Jimmy. Woo.
Today on Carcass, rain, sleet, or snow, Project Junk Mail gets major suspension upgrades, taking our Jeep from a mail delivery vehicle to an off-road machine that can handle all the elements.
We'll show you how to set up a race-inspired 4-link system that will conquer the trails and rocks. Hey guys, welcome to Carcass. Now our 1978 Jeep DJ5 that we're calling Project Junk Mail looks a whole lot different than the day that we picked it up.
That's right, we got the cab off the chassis, stripped all the old suspension brackets off, and we even went to a junkyard, got a set of axles, and got them all the way down to the housings.
Now we slid our axles underneath our chassis to give us an initial look at what we're dealing with. And we're going to be prepping for our 4-link suspension, but we're going to add a set of axle trusses to give us a good foundation for that suspension. So we got to slide these babies out, set them on a set of axle stands, and start prepping.
To clean up our axles, we're using some wire wheels. We just want to knock off the rust and grime to give our trusses a good clean surface to weld to.
With our axles all cleaned up, we're going to be adding a set of Artec Industries axle trusses that we picked up from SummitRacing.com. We're going to be doing this for 2 reasons. One, it's just going to help strengthen our axle, and the second, more important reason, is it's going to give us a great mounting point for our upper arms and for our shocks. So what we're going to do is just tack this into place, then we'll set our axles back underneath the chassis, keep rolling on our suspension. All right, that looks pretty good. Get her back under the chassis. Got it? Yeah. Got a little heavier, that's for sure.
We now have trusses tacked to both axle housings, but there's one thing we need to do before we start designing our suspension, and that's deciding where the axles are going to land. And in the rear, it's not too critical, but we do know we're going to extend the wheelbase a little bit for stability.
But on the front end, it is critical because the position of our front axle solely depends on the position of our steering gearbox, because we don't want our steering to bind under heavy articulation. So the next step is to mount the gearbox on the passenger side. We mounted our new gearbox using an existing hole from the original box. Now this is just for mock-up. We're not sure if we're going to have to move the gearbox towards the back or to the front of the Jeep, but this is just a good starting point. Now with our axle and our chassis set at ride height, I'm going to use a plumb bob and drop it down the center of our pitman arm. And then we're going to mock up some steering, and that should help us find the final resting position of our front axle. Well, now that we have the steering mocked up on our front axle, we now know that the stock location we chose for the gearbox should work out just fine. What we also noticed is that the axle is now about 3 inches further forward than the stock location, which extends our wheelbase. And having a longer wheelbase, well, that always just helps out on the trail. Now, this is the position of our front axle. Figuring out where our rear axle is going to sit, well, that's just a whole lot easier. Now the look that we're going for in the rear is pretty simple. We want the tire to stick out of the back of the Jeep just a little bit. Since we're running 37-inch tall tires, all we did is measure in from the back of the chassis about 18 inches, and we set our axle right here. Now that's 8 inches further back than the factory location, further extending our wheelbase. Now we're running a triangulated 4-link suspension, and that is exactly what it sounds like. We're gonna be running a set of upper links and a set of lower links from the axle up to the chassis. Now what that's gonna do is it's gonna help center our axle from left to right. It's gonna give us some adjustability, and it's gonna give us better articulation when we're out on the trails. Now we gotta figure out where we're gonna mount all of this stuff. And there's a couple of things that we need to know, but let me show you what we're talking about. What we're trying to do with our suspension is land on a value. That value is called our anti-squat number. To figure out our anti-squat, we need to project some lines on our chassis. The first line will be the center of gravity, and for us that's basically the center of the camshaft, which is about 9 inches above our motor mounts. The next vertical lines will be the center of our front and our rear tire, also known as the contact patch. And the third line will be our anti-squat line, which is run from the contact patch of the rear tire to where the center of gravity and the center of the front tire meet. Where those lines meet will help us choose where we put our mounts for our upper and our lower links. The position of those bars will create a point that's called an instant center. And where that point lands in relationship to our anti-squat line will determine how our suspension will handle. As you change the position of your mounts, that will change where the instant center will land, and that will determine how your suspension reacts. And knowing these parameters will help you guys figure out where to put the mounts for your suspension. And for us in Project Junk Mail, it's gonna be an all-around off-road rig. It may see some rocks, it may see some mud, but it's gonna see a lot of trail riding. So we're gonna try to land as close as we can to that 100% anti-squat line. But if we're above or below it by 20%, we'll be just fine. Now the next step for us is to just start laying out some lines. We have a plan. We'll show you how to build a heavy-duty 4-link suspension that can handle anything the trail has to offer. Now that we have the links mocked up on our suspension, we can project the lines out to find our instant center and see how close we are to that 100% anti-squat line that we've been shooting for. Now to mount our suspension, it's going to be pretty simple. Here on the rear axle, we're just going to use a couple taps. But on the frame side, we're gonna have to build some mounts. So we went ahead and used a piece of cardboard to help show where we're gonna mount our lower links. And for our upper links, they're gonna be pretty basic. We're just gonna weld a tab to the inside of the chassis here. But this is just half of our suspension. We're also gonna need to build the links that connect the axle to the frame. And now that we know where those mounts are, we can actually start cutting some tubing and building our suspension. For our links, we're gonna use 2-inch by 1/4-inch wall DOM that we had laying around the shop. It's super strong and should be able to take plenty of abuse. We'll cut our lowers to 43 inches and our uppers to 38. This will give us a little wiggle room when we do our final mock-up. Now that I got some links cut out, it's time to start assembly. We're gonna be using 1.25 by 1-inch rod ends. Now we're using these because of their strength and their flexibility. These also come with some threaded tube inserts. Now there's a left and a right-hand side to these inserts, and we're gonna be using both. That way, if we need to adjust our suspension when we're underneath the Jeep, all we gotta do is give the tube a little twist, and then we'll just lock down our jam nut. But to get this whole party started, I gotta tack in some of these inserts. When welding these up, you don't want to bottom out your tube insert. You'll want to leave a little space to give you a nice channel to weld to. With our tube inserts tacked in, we can install our rod ends. Now to go along with our rod ends, we're going to be running some high misalignment spacers. What these do is extend the radius of the ball, and they give us more flex and articulation out of our joint. They also add a little bit of width, and they step the inside bore from 1 inch down to 3/4 of an inch. Now with all this mocked up, we can take our tubes over to our Jeep, keep rolling on our suspension. All right, let's see how this fits on the axle. All right, that'll work right there. Let's get a couple tacks on it to hold it in.
You got one corner done.
Yeah, the brackets you made down here on the axle are perfect, but I'm gonna need you to do one more thing, and that's make this big guy.
Oh. See, this is why I love CNC plasma tables.
Right, you can use a new table, and I'll go ahead and get started on the other side.
Perfect. Coming up, we design and build some custom mounting brackets for Junk Mail's off-road suspension. Jeremy and I have made some pretty good progress on our full-length suspension system for our Jeep, but we're at the point now where we need some brackets to finish it out. He gave me this template, but there's a few more things I need to do before we can cut it out on our CNC plasma table. I'm actually going to take a few measurements and transfer this into our 3D CAD program, and then we can start cutting some metal. Everything looks pretty good, so all we have to do is transfer it to a USB drive and take it over to our plasma table. To cut out our brackets, we'll be using our CNC plasma table from Premier Plasma. In a fab shop like ours, it's the ultimate time saver. This table can handle a 4x4 sheet of steel or any other metal, which gives the potential to mass produce small brackets or build something bigger like the back half of a chassis. This table is built with heavy-duty components to give smooth motion and ensure accurate cuts. Another optional feature is the torch height controller, or THC. By nature, metal sheets are usually bowed or wavy. The THC keeps the torch at the optimal height to improve accuracy. Premier Plasma can accommodate any shop. They offer tables from 2x2 all the way to 5x10 and even have router attachments available for those who work with metal and wood. And it's all made here in the USA. With the outside brackets done now, I adjusted the original template to accommodate the bracket that goes on the inside of the chassis rail. So I have that and a few more pieces to cut out, and then our suspension mounts are done. For our brackets, we're using 3/16 hot rolled, pickled, and oiled steel. The pickled and oiled version is better than normal hot rolled steel because it doesn't have the mill scale on it. And the 3/16 material is going to be plenty strong for our suspension. I got a puzzle for you.
Whoa, those look just like the brackets on the axle.
Yeah, so like the trusses, in the big pieces, there's slots, and then the internal pieces have a tab on them so that it goes into the slot, and it's gonna make it a little bit easier to line up, and it's gonna give it some internal support.
Yeah, I think this is gonna be a whole lot easier to do this on a bench versus the chassis.
Yeah. I'm gonna work on the inner upper mounts too.
All right, I'm gonna go put these together. Just like the axle trusses, there's a few pieces we need to put together to make these brackets. First, I'll start assembly. Then I'll add a couple of tacks. And it's back over to the chassis for a test fit. Before attaching our mounts, we'll grind away some of the rust on our chassis, giving us a good surface to weld to. Now we can clamp in our mount and tack it in. Ow, that landed on my leg. Because the width of our heim joints, the inside of our 4-link bracket extends past the chassis just a little bit. So we designed this top plate to help strengthen the mount. Now when I put the two pieces together, it doesn't leave me much of a surface area to weld to. So what we're gonna do is grab a grinder and bevel the outside edges of both plates, creating kind of a trough. Now what that's gonna do is give us better penetration and a stronger weld. Nothing too drastic, just enough to give us good penetration for when we go back to finish weld it later. With our lower mount tacked in, we can move on to the upper mount that Jimmy knocked out on the plasma table. Then from here, we can cut the bars to length and finish up our rear suspension. With our mounts in place, we can measure our links, cut them to length, weld in our heims, and bolt them up. With our links installed, that wraps up the bulk of our rear suspension, and it's time to transition to the front. And that's pretty much rinse and repeat, with the exception of one thing.
And that one thing is a clearance issue. I've already designed and tacked in the upper mount on the axle, and pretty much wherever we put the other mounts on the chassis, the 4-link bars are going to hit this crossmember, but we do have a solution.
We're gonna end up getting rid of this crossmember completely, and we'll build 2 separate engine mounts and just weld those directly to the chassis. Now, we're not too concerned about losing the support of this crossmember, because when we put the bumper on the front of the Jeep, we're just gonna weld it to the frame anyways.
So the first thing we gotta do is get that crossmember out of the way so we can keep rolling on our suspension.
Just like the rear, we'll clean up our chassis and weld in all our brackets. Once in place, we can measure for our link bars and cut them out. 28. Then we'll tack in our rod ends and set them in place.
Dude, this thing's looking so trick, and I am so glad that we got that plasma table.
Yeah, everything turned out pretty good. All we got left now are the shocks. Junk Mail gets a coil-over suspension that will help us crush any terrain. When it comes time to picking out the shocks and struts for your next project, you need to remember that they are key to ride quality and the foundation of your suspension system. Well, Summit Racing has a wide variety of shocks and struts to choose from. So let's take a look at a couple options. A gas adjust shock has performance advantages over a traditional twin tube design, like an increase in steering response and stability. The monotube design responds instantly to driver's inputs and delivers an increase in handling. An on-the-car adjustable shock makes it easy for you to dial in your desired level of comfort and performance. Quick bolt-in installation can be done in minutes, and it's designed to be used with your stock-style springs. An integrated air spring and shock absorber system like this one replaces your car or truck's metal springs with a pressure-adjustable airbag. And these are great because you can adjust them from inside your vehicle. A direct replacement coilover shock gives you the ability to adjust and revalve to fit your needs. They allow you to tune them to different driving styles. Plus, they're a direct bolt-in for a lot of vehicles, making them a popular swap. And lastly, the universal coilover shock is designed to be used with dual rate springs. They come in a wide range of travel lengths, making them perfect for custom suspension setups. And for us in our 4-link Jeep, these things are going to work perfectly.
With the suspension linkage all done, it's time to move on to that last piece.
And to get the shocks installed, it's going to be pretty basic. What we're going to do is weld some tabs onto the axle, and then we're going to build some shock hoops and weld those directly to the chassis. But we're not going to use the shocks to do any of the mock-up.
And the reason for that is because the chassis is already at ride height, so with the shocks fully extended, they're not going to work for mock-up. So instead, we have this tube that mimics the length of the shock at ride height. That way we can accurately place the tabs and the shock hoop.
And to get all this started, first we got to take a couple measurements to put on the tabs.
These measurements aren't too critical. We just want the bracket inboard enough to clear our brake components and outboard far enough so that the shock body clears the chassis. Then we'll tack in our tabs. Now that we have the tabs on our axle, it's time to figure out the hoop section. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a tube and bend it 180 degrees and weld it to the chassis. But we have to figure out what length of tube to cut. So if I stand up this tube that represents our shock, it stands up about a foot off the chassis and a little bit shorter on this side, but it's best to have some excess. And we know from experience using our bender, the 180 degree section is going to take up about 18 inches of tube. 18 plus 24 is 42, and that's the length we need to cut. For our shock hoop, we'll be using some 120 wall DOM. With our shock hoop bent up now, the first noticeable thing is that our simulated shock does not fall in the center of it. But the idea here is the shock hoop is going to fall on the box section of the chassis to maintain strength. So the compromise is to lean the shock over a little bit and let the tabs fall right in the center. But before we get to the tabs, we got to tack this thing in. We'll give the chassis a quick grind before installing our hoop.
Go ahead.
We'll make sure this thing is square and drop in a couple tacks. Then we'll head back over to our plasma table and cut out a few tabs to mount our shocks.
You know, that plasma table came in pretty handy building all of these brackets.
It's a great machine.
The suspension is all tacked in underneath our Jeep, and from what we can see, everything should work out pretty good. Still got a couple things we got to do. We got to tie the shock hoops in front and rear, but we're going to do that after the body's on it.
So all we really have to do now is build out the axles, put the drivetrain in the chassis, and put the body on it so we can really see how this thing sits.
I think we'll save that for next time. If you guys like anything you've seen on the show today, why don't you check out PowerNationTV.com, and we'll see you next time. Can't wait to get this thing on the trails.
It's going to be a good time.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. Today on Carcass, our DJ5 Jeep has made a drastic change from its days delivering the mail, with a 4-link suspension and coil-over shocks.
We take it another step further with new gears and lockers for our 1-ton axles to help us conquer the trails. Plus, get the drivetrain in and mounted.
Then we'll tackle our steering to get junk mail rolling once again. Hey guys, welcome to Carcass. Our 1978 Jeep DJ5 has made quite a big transformation from the 2-wheel drive ex-Postal Jeep that it was into this 4-wheel drive, fully functional off-road rig.
And we've done a ton of work so far. With our Jeep in the shop, we stripped it down all the way to the bare chassis and removed all of the old suspension brackets. Then we went to a junkyard and picked up a set of 1-ton axles from a Ford Super Duty. We cleaned those up, added a set of axle trusses, and then we threw them under the Jeep so we could fabricate our custom 4-link suspension.
So the plan today is to build the complete front and rear axle and set the drivetrain in the chassis.
We also want to put the body on it to make this thing a roller, so the first thing we have to do is get the axles back out from under it.
Now we're building our Jeep on a budget. That's why we're spending the money where we want to and saving the money where we can. That's also why we built our own 4-link suspension and went out and got a set of junkyard axles. Well, to build out those axles, we went to summitracing.com and picked up a whole bunch of good parts. And that starts with Richmond Gear 488 ring and pinion gears. Now these are a huge upgrade over our original setup. These get bolted to a Yukon Grizzly fully mechanical locker. Now this provides 100% power to our tires when we need it. We also picked up a set of stock replacement 35 splined axle shafts. Now we don't know how many miles are on our original axle shafts, but they'll be a good backup set for when we're out on the trails. We also got a set of mile marker premium locking hubs and a Summit Racing aluminum diff cover. Now all these parts should make our Dana 60 pretty much bulletproof. The first thing I gotta do to get this whole build started is put the ring gear on our locker. With our ring gear on, we can add a few bolts to hold it in place. We'll add a little thread locker to the rest of the fasteners and tighten them down. Finally, we can torque them down to 110 pound-feet. With our ring gear on our carrier and torqued down, the next step is to install the races for the pinion bearings. Then I'll go ahead and install the pinion, drop the carrier in, and we'll start taking some measurements. We'll give it a few whacks with our hammer, and we should be good. That's seated. With our axle flipped over, we'll knock in the race for our inner bearing. Now that our races are installed, it's time to set up our pinion. We're using some setup bearings. Now these bearings are made to slide on and off our pinion shaft without using a press. The reason why we're doing that is there's a shim down here at the bottom that sets our pinion depth. Now you can either buy or make these, and we just chose to make ours out of our old set. Now to get started, all I gotta do is slide these on and check our pinion. With our pinion in, we can now check our backlash. I already installed some setup bearings and some shims on the carrier. So now all I gotta do is drop this in and see how close we are. Jimmy, can you give me a hand here?
Yeah, let's do it.
Nice and easy, I like my fingers. I'm gonna let go now. Now we'll just set our bearing caps in place, making sure that we line up our reference marks, and then I'll just snug them down. Now with everything snugged up, we can check our backlash. It shows about 11, which is pretty close. I think we can move forward from here. Well, now that everything checks out, we can disassemble the case, pull out our pinion, and press on our real bearings. Once disassembled, we'll head over to the press, add our new bearings to the pinion, and then reinstall it in our axle. All right, that should do it. We'll check the preload. And that looks pretty good. Now that we have our pinion bearings in place, we can add our new bearings to our diff. The press makes quick work of this, and we're ready to install it back in our axle. We'll snug down our caps, and then torque them down. That is exactly 10. To check our contact pattern, we'll add a little gear marking compound to the ring gear and give it a few turns. Yep, that right there, that's a good pattern. Then we'll slap on a fresh gasket, bolt on our new diff cover, and slide in our new axles that we got from Summit Racing. With our axles in, now we can start working on our hubs. And our old bearings were worn out, so we went to AutoZone and picked up a set of Duralast hub assemblies. Duralast has a full line of steering, drivetrain, and chassis parts, all of which are designed, manufactured, and tested to meet or exceed OEM specifications. These wheel bearing assemblies eliminate noise with lubricated, maintenance-free bearings and come with a 2-year warranty. And to wrap up our hub assembly, we'll install a set of manual lockouts. With our front axle pretty much wrapped up, now I got to transfer over to the rear, finish that one up too.
We have to make some quick adjustments and fabricate some brackets.
Then we can mount our drivetrain in our chassis. Hey guys, welcome back. Now we got our axles pretty much buttoned up, but before we can slide them underneath the chassis, we got one more thing that we want to take care of here on the front end. We're going to be doing a brake system upgrade using EBC brake pads and their rotors. For our rotors, we're going with their GD Sport series. They have wide slots that draw in cool air between their brake pad and rotor surface, and that keeps temps down. They have a thermic black coating to help with corrosion, and another advantage is their ability to maintain a flat pad surface throughout the lifetime of their brake pad setup. Speaking of brake pads, we're also going to be using their yellow stuff pads. Now these have a high friction formula that helps improve braking by up to 30%. They're available for light truck, Jeep, and SUVs. And now all I got to do is set these on our front axle, and then we can slide those underneath our Jeep. While we're freshening up our brake system, we went to rockauto.com and got a new set of caliper mounting brackets and calipers to go along with our new EBC brake pads and rotors. With our axles all buttoned up and slid underneath our chassis, we went ahead and dropped in the engine and the transmission, but we're running into a little bit of an issue.
I was going to put in one of the upper 4-link bars, and it's already hitting the starter without the suspension even being cycled. So this is a great example of why you mock things up, because you can always go back and change them later.
And by changing the position of the upper link mount, well, that's going to change the geometry of our suspension. But this is just one of those instances where we're going to have to change some stuff to make everything work out.
So the first thing we got to do is just cut out the mounts. We'll use a cutoff wheel to make quick work of our tacks. Now that we have our brackets cut out, I found a pretty simple solution. All we're going to do is tilt the bracket down a little bit. That way we get the vertical clearance on the starter, and our links won't change the length that much. Now all we got to do is tack this back in, hook up our links, and cycle the suspension. All right, I think that's gonna work. With our suspension dialed in now, we can finally move on to mounting the engine. And if you guys remember, we had to take a cross member out of here, so we have to make some standalone engine mounts. And Jeremy actually had a pretty good idea on how to do that.
The motor mounts that bolted to our 6-cylinder engine were two different styles. On the driver's side, it went away from the oil pan. But on the passenger side, it actually went underneath the oil pan, and that's not going to work for us because of our suspension. But there was a solution to this. I went out to our parts Jeeps and I grabbed another driver's side motor mount. So now I have two motor mounts that bolt directly to our engine and go away from the oil pan. I also went to Summit Racing and picked up some polyurethane mounts. So now what I got to do is assemble these, put them on the engine, and then we'll start working on the chassis side. All right, Jimmy, we're all set.
Awesome. With the mounts on the engine, it's now time to focus on the chassis side of things, so I'll take a couple measurements so we can cut them out on the CNC plasma table. Yeah, we'll call that 3/4. Chassis is about 4.5 tall. Once we have our measurements, we can start cutting out our new engine mounts on our Premier plasma table. Then we'll add a couple quick tacks and mount them onto our chassis.
With the engine mounts tacked in, it's time to move on to our transmission cross member. Now, we already know from taking a couple measurements that the transmission won't sit directly in between the frame rails with the transfer case attached. But there's a simple solution to this. What we're going to do is actually clock our transfer case down about 13 degrees, and that's going to help with two different things. That will allow us to center our transmission, and it's actually going to help with our front drive shaft angle. Now, they do make a tool to do this. It's called a clocking ring. You guys can go out and buy these, but since we have a plasma table, we took a couple measurements and made up our own. So what I have to do now is bolt this to the back of the transmission, punch out, drill out a series of holes. We'll bolt up the transfer case, center our transmission, and then we can get on to building that cross member. Here we go. You got the heavy end now. You gotta make sure to go in the holes. There we go. Oh, that slid right in there.
All right, how's it over there?
Perfect. We gained at least 2 inches of clearance, so we're plenty good on this side.
Yeah. All right, now I'm gonna start making the trans cross member, but we'll actually take this back out and I'll take some measurements and cut it out.
Right, you'll go around, obviously, the drive shaft on this side.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Let's get it out of here. You wanna bring it my way?
Yeah.
And then I'll go put it on the table.
It's about 8. With our measurements, we can start cutting out our transmission mount. Then start piecing it together on our welding table. All right, this thing looks like it fits perfectly, so all I gotta do now is finish weld it, and then we can move on to the transfer case.
Coming up, we'll tackle our steering and get junk mail ready to roll. Now we're making really good headway on the drivetrain installer project, junk mail, and it's time to move on to the transfer case. Now we're running a 32 RH transmission, but we opted to go with the 241 Rubicon series transfer case. Now these two bolt up, but they don't seal up. But we do have a solution. We went to Summit Racing and picked up a TerraFlex seal extension. So all I have to do is pop out the old seal, pop in this new extension piece, we'll throw the transfer case on, and then we're moving up front to work on some steering. Wow, there it goes. All right, well, the transfer case is in. Now let's move on to the steering.
For our steering system, we're going with the PSC Hydro Assist setup that we got from Summit Racing. This kit includes everything from the steering box, the reservoir, the pump, the hydraulic ram, and all the fittings and hoses needed to complete the kit. On our Jeep, we're going with crossover steering and 37-inch tall tires, and this kit is designed to handle the higher steering forces. And even if we went with a bigger tire, this kit would still handle it no problem. So the first thing we're going to do is mount this pump, then move on to the rest of the steering. We'll mount up our pump using a bracket I fabricated on the plasma table. Then I'll take a few measurements, 5 5/8. Make a few marks on our frame, and then drill some holes so we can install our steering box. I've got our steering gearbox in its final resting place, but there's a few reinforcements I want to do to make it stronger. In the meantime, we can move on to some other components and finish up our steering.
The next step in the process is our tie rod bar. Now I've already taken a couple measurements, so I know the length of tube that I need to cut. And then from here, we'll head over to the bench and I'll weld in a couple tube inserts. And then we'll keep moving on our steering. With our tube cut, I want to make a few bends so that our tie rod bar will clear our new diff cover. We'll add a 20-degree bend to each end of our steering linkage to help with clearance. That should work. We'll hold it all together with the TIG.
All right, let's see it.
Yeah, you take that side. I'll wait for you to get yours before I start mine. It's heavy. We'll just hand tighten this for now. Let's cycle this once and see how much room we have on the diff cover.
Yeah, plenty.
Yeah, that should work good.
Nicely done. Let me get the cylinder and we'll get that on here too.
Sounds good.
Can you hold this while I tack it?
Yeah, you know where you're gonna put it?
Just as far over to the passenger side as I can, just to avoid the pumpkin over there.
That'll work.
All right, ready?
Yep.
We made sure our toe angle was relatively close before burning it in.
With the cylinder installed, we can finally add some hoses and finish plumbing up the system. Then we can set the body back on the chassis and see what this thing looks like.
We'll have to make a few more body mods before we get junk mail rolling.
We're making really good headway on Project Junk Mail. We've pretty much buttoned up the suspension, we threw in the drivetrain, bolted our shocks back up, and we even mounted a set of wheels and tires.
But before we final weld all the suspension, we want to throw the body on it to do some final checks. And we do know we're gonna have to cut some holes in it so we can clear the rear shock hoops. And the easiest way to do that is to roll this thing over to the lift and see what we're working with.
Turn a little bit here. It's hard to tell where we're at.
It's pretty close.
Yeah, let's grab some plumb bobs and we'll drop them down from the rear mounts and see how close we are. Tires off the ground. That's probably enough.
That's probably good.
Yep.
That's a nice piece right there.
Okay, I'm gonna go down slow. You let me know when we get close because the hoist arm's gonna block me, so.
stop right there. Yeah, that's good. We'll mark out the area that needs to be removed. Our lines don't have to be super precise, just straight enough to give us a guide. Yeah. Something like that. We're using cutoff wheels for our application, but you could use a plasma cutter as well. Either way makes quick work of our floor. We'll yank off the wheels and tires and remove our shocks so we can lower the body down onto our chassis.
Full speed, see what happens.
Keep going. Stop.
Like that. We look close. How's it look inside?
It looks nice. Yeah, I think we should be able to get the shocks in there.
Yeah, that totally fits. I think the shocks will fit. We'll throw in some new body mounts and drop our shocks back in before setting the body back down. Here we go.
A lot of room between the firewall and valve cover.
All right, I'm down on the back. Hoist arms are coming off.
Getting close.
Keep going?
Yeah.
How are you looking?
Transfer case is clear and everything. Yeah.
Oh, cool, we're up on the front. How much room do we have between the firewall?
Inch.
Oh, yeah. There's some wiring there, but we're good. Let's get the front clip on it then.
Yeah.
Get fenders in the grill shell.
Make it look like a Jeep again.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I'll go grab them. All right, let's see how these fenders fit. Got a pretty good idea that we were gonna have to do some trimming here. So I think if we just cut out this indent right here on the inner fender, that should allow the fender to slide in and match up with the grill shell. To cut out our fender, I'll use a cutoff wheel. It makes it easy to follow the desired shape we're looking for to make room for our shocks. Jim, you wanna grab the back side, bolt that in.
That should be good for now. This thing's looking so good and the parts are really coming together.
Yeah, but now we got the big order of tearing this thing all back apart because we still have to finish weld the chassis. We want to paint the stuff underneath. We got to get inside, and there's a laundry list of stuff to do before we go wheeling.
Yeah, well, that's for another day. If you guys saw anything you liked on the show, go to PowerNationTV.com.
Falling in love with this thing more and more.
It's awesome.
Today on Carcass, Junk Mail gets a few body modifications to make room for some bigger wheels and tires.
Plus, we address some safety issues on our interior by adding a roll cage, then tear it all apart to add some color. Hey guys, welcome to Carcass. We still have a lot of work to do before we can take our 78 DJ5 Jeep out on the trails, but it's made quite a transformation from the two-wheel drive Postal Jeep that first rolled in the shop. Our 1978 DJ5 Postal Jeep has been a blast to work on. We cleaned up the frame and prepped it for new suspension. We picked up a set of 1-ton axles and added bomb-proof goodies to help us handle anything the trail could throw at us. Then we slid them underneath our chassis, mounted up our 4-link suspension and coilover shocks. Next, we dropped in the drivetrain and added a 4-to-1 transfer case, taking it from 2-wheel drive to 4. We put the body back on and made some modifications to give us some room for all of our additions.
And we have a mailbag of stuff that we need to do. We need to fab up some bumpers, front and rear, and add a winch. We got to make some body mods because we have some clearance issues. We're going to get inside the cab, strip out the interior, and add a roll bar. Then we're going to come back out and throw on a fresh coat of paint. But the big question is where do we even start?
I think I'm going to take care of the winch and the front and rear bumpers.
Cool. I'm going to do the body mods.
Awesome.
On the front fender, it's going to be pretty basic. All we're going to do is follow the line from the side of the fender across the front, and then we'll arc it over here on the end, give it just a little bit of design. Using the tape as a guide, we'll use a cutoff wheel to make our modifications. Cutting them out this much should give us plenty of room for our 37-inch tall tires. Simple as that.
While Jeremy was cutting out the fenders, I took a few measurements for our winch plate and I've already transferred it to the computer. So now we can cut it on the CNC plasma table along with a few other brackets, and then once we get it assembled, I'll be ready to start on the bumpers. With the winch plate cut out, we can tack and weld in our riser brackets. These will lift our mounting plate up to match the contour of the frame, making everything level. Then I'll drop on the winch plate. That's gonna be nice. And fully weld it in. With that in place, I can install our winch. All right, time to move on to the bumper.
With the clearance issues taken care of in the front of the Jeep, it's time to move to the back. Now you guys can pretty much see that these big tires are going to contact the body as the suspension flexes out. But the simple solution to that is to just come in here and cut a big chunk out of the rear quarter. We also plan on running the stock doors because we love the look of them, but there's an issue there as well. As you slide the door open, the corner of the door contacts the tire. Now I have a fix for that, but we'll get to that a little bit later. To get down to the quarter and get this whole thing started, I gotta slide the door out of the way. Now that our door is out of the way, I'll loosen a few bolts, that one broke, and remove the track. Just like in the front, I'll lay down our cut line using some masking tape. Now we can start cutting out our quarter, making sure to follow our line as close as possible.
With our winch plate in place, it's time to start on the front bumper setup. I kind of have a unique design in my head that starts with a hoop that goes around the grill, and then it'll tie into the front bumper. So right now I just have to cut this tube, put a couple bends in it, and then we'll be ready to put it on the truck. Right at 74. With our tube cut to length, I'll head over to the tubing bender. With the design I'm going for, the tube will need to be bent to 120 degrees on each side. With that done, I'll head over to the Jeep. Can you hold this while I tack it?
Sure. I'm good.
Now that our main grill hoop is in place, I'll head back over to the bender and start the main part of our front bumper. We have to bend it past 90 degrees in order to account for the spring back. Once bent, I'll use a grinder to notch the ends, set it in place, and drop in a few tacks. All right, it's time to tack it. Then building off of the main hoop, I'll finish out the front bumper and add a plate to the front to give it a clean look. Now that I have the front plate tacked in, the front bumper setup is pretty much done. There's a couple things I want to do still, like add some tube caps here, and also run a bar on either side to connect the hoop in the front bumper. But once we're done with all that, we can move on to the back.
Now there's one more thing we have to take care of before we jump inside and tackle the interior. We plan on running the stock doors because we like the look of them and they're functional. But when you open the door, the corner hits the tire. Well, we came up with a solution on how to make this line so we can cut the corner off of it. If we just use the old piece of the quarter panel, set it up here on the door, I'll just trace this line and we'll get to cutting. All right, now all I gotta do is cap the edge of this door off here, take care of the sharp fender lip, and we're good to go. We tear into our interior, adding some support and safety measures with a few custom touches.
We made a lot of progress on the exterior of our Jeep. I finished welded the front bumper setup, and I also reinstalled the winch just to make sure everything fits, and it's all looking really good.
We took care of some clearance issues on the front fenders and the rear quarters. We notched out the door to fit around our bigger tires, and I even finished off the edge for a nice clean look.
I also fabricated the rear bumper, which was a lot simpler than the front, but kind of kept it the same style with the two tubes stacked on top of one another.
And now it's time to get to work on the inside. Inside, we got a little bit of work to do. We got to get rid of the seat and the package tray and then move on to bending up our roll bar. We'll start by taking out a few bolts that hold in our seat. Followed by the mail tray.
All right. All right.
Yeah, that ain't gonna work. With the seat out of the Jeep, we started cleaning up and we found something. The floor inside's basically shot, and the plan is to tie our down bar in up here, and that's just not gonna work with the shape that this thing is in. So what I wanna do is just quickly cut this out and replace it with a brand new one. That way when the down bar comes in, we got something nice and strong to weld to.
While Jeremy's working on the floor, I'm gonna start in the back on the roll cage, and the first thing I gotta do is cut out some base plates on the bandsaw. For our plates, we're using some 1/8" steel cut into 3x5 rectangles. This will give us plenty of room for our roll cage to mount to. Once they're cut out, I'll head back over to the Jeep, grind off some of the old paint, add a few tacks to our mounting plates to hold them into place, then go back and finish welding them to the body. We've got our base plates welded in now, so we can start to measure for our main hoop, and Jeremy's gonna hold up a cheater tube that we have so we can figure out the length of the tube. 20.5, measure vertical, that's 27.25, plus whatever the bend is. If we add up the measurements we took plus the amount of tube it takes for the bend, we got 60 inches, but that's only half the hoop, so we multiply it by 2 to get 120, and we'll add a couple inches for a little bit of wiggle room, so we'll mark it at 122. Once marked, I'll take our tube over to the chop saw to make our cut. Then it's back to the tube bender. I'll make our first bend at 90 degrees. On a piece this big, I like to flip the machine vertically and check before bending the other side, making sure our bends are on the same plane. Perfect. Let's see how it fits. All right, this thing is fitting perfectly. It fits really tight to the body, so we can tack it in now, and then we can start working on the down bars. Looks like 42. With the measurement of our down bars, I'll just cut, notch, and tack them into place as well. Then we can repeat the same process with our crossbar and get it installed. You want to hold this up there?
Yeah.
And I'll tack it.
Sure. So, tight to that side, off of this side. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm good. Whenever you're ready. With the floor in, Jimmy can now come up front and finish out our cage, and I'm going to transfer to the back, tie in our down bars to our chassis, and build a cover for our shock hoops. Using the plates that Jimmy made for our roll cage, I'll drill out a few holes, bolt in the bottom plate, and weld in our support tubes that attach to our frame. Doing this will help strengthen our down bars on our cage. Once this is done, I can head over to the slip roller and start making our cover for our shock hoops. Before installing it, I need to cut out some of the old floor so we can come back later and install our shock hoop braces. Let's see how this thing fits. That's pretty good. Let's weld it up. Well, with our cover and our cage in place, that pretty much wraps up the interior. Now we got to start prepping for some paint.
We tear everything apart so we can finish up our chassis, getting it ready for paint.
With everything wrapped up on the inside of junk mail, it's time to rip the body off of this thing so I can take it down and start prepping for paint.
And I also have to take the chassis and suspension completely apart so I can finish weld it, add some gussets and supports where it needs it, and I'm going to clean the chassis and paint it too.
Jimmy, you want to put your eyes on the front? I'm going to pick the body up.
Yeah.
Good.
With everything blown apart, it's time to final weld the chassis. With the body out of the way, welding up all of our brackets and tabs is super easy. When welding this much, you want to make sure you don't stay in one area for too long. I like to bounce back and forth to let the metal cool. I finished welding all the brackets on the chassis, but I did find a crack up on the frame rail that I need to take care of. I'll start by cleaning up the area using a Benchmark Abrasives Zirconia flat disc. They're manufactured using uniform particle size and a premium blend of ingredients that exceed other flat discs by packing up to 50% more abrasives on each flat. Benchmark's products are made to exact specifications to provide reliable quality products. Now that it's prepped, I'll weld up our crack, go back and grind it smooth. With that taken care of, we can start cleaning up our chassis. I'll be using a knotted carbon steel cut brush that we also got from Benchmark Abrasives. These carbon steel cups are great for cleaning up rust and removing paint on ferrous metal, aluminum, and other non-ferrous metals. Using a carbon brush on stainless creates contamination, which leads to rust. The knotted wire style brush we're using is best suited for heavy material removal like we have on our old Jeep frame. With our chassis prepped, it's finally time for some new paint. I did wipe everything down with a little bit of acetone to give us a good base for our new spray paint, and this stuff is going to protect it from the elements. On our first coat, I'm just giving it light coverage to give us a tacky surface to give our other coats something to adhere to. You want to make sure you're in a well-ventilated area when spraying. We have a huge shop with an exhaust fan, but I put on my mask once I start applying heavier coats. That wraps up the paint for the chassis, but I still have to paint the 4-link bars and the axles a matching color. So once those are done, we can start putting this thing back together.
Bodywork is done. Now it's time to give junk mail a facelift with a fresh coat of paint. Well, Jimmy's been down in the shop thrashing on the chassis. I've got the Jeep body in the booth and we're ready to lay down some paint. Now we're going to be paying homage to the old postal Jeep theme, so our colors are going to be red, white, and blue. What I'm going to do is paint the top of the Jeep white, so what I have to do now is mask the bottom of the Jeep off, then we'll spray the top with some sealer and move on to some color. All right, with everything masked off, we'll go ahead and mix some sealer and start spraying. We'll be using a primer sealer that we got from Summit Racing mixed to a 5:1 ratio with a hardener. This is going to help fill in some of our sand scratches and seal the surface so we have a good base to lay down some color. We'll be applying 2 medium coats, letting it dry for up to 30 minutes between each application. Once our sealer is dry, we'll mix up our single stage white that we're using for our top. And I'll lay down 2 coats, allowing it to flash about 10 minutes between each coat. With our top sprayed, we're going to move on to our second color. So I'm going to mask the roof off so I can start laying down some paint. Now we know the body work is pretty crude, but we also know that this thing is an off-road rig and it's going to get beat up and scratched up when it's out on the trails. All we're looking to do here is change color and give it a completely different look. I'll mask and cover the white we just sprayed. Using a tack cloth, I'll clean one last time, making sure to get rid of any dust or dirt that may have been kicked up while we sprayed our top. With it clean, we'll spray the sealer on our body and our panels, just like we did for our roof. Now that the sealer has had time to dry, it's time to move on to some color. And just like the top, we're going to be spraying some single stage paint that we got from Summit Racing. And the color of choice is Royal Blue Pearl. This is mixed in a 4:1 ratio just like our white. Summit's single stage paints offer a premium finish with exceptional durability. It's resistant to yellowing and doesn't need to be top coated for UV protection. Since our paint is a pearl, we'll be laying it down with a 75% overlap to achieve maximum coverage. Spraying 3 medium wet coats, allowing for 5-minute dry times between each coat. For the final application, I'll be applying a drop coat to give us a uniformed look.
You know, this thing turned out really good, and I didn't realize it had metallic in it.
Yeah, it actually laid down really nice. How did the chassis turn out?
It turned out pretty good. I mean, it's spray paint, right, but it's gray. So otherwise, I mean, we got plumbing, wiring, got to get it running, and then we can hit the trail.
Then we can hit the trails. And I actually still have one more thing that I want to do on the paint side. We're going to lay down a red pinstripe on the top of the Jeep. But that pretty much wraps it up for us today. So if you guys like anything you've seen on the show, why don't you go to PowerNationTV.com. Jimmy and I will see you next time. Let's go take a look at this chassis.
Yeah, spray cans, man. I went through like a dozen.
Is that like way quicker than spray paint?
Yeah. Today on Carcass, it's been a long road, but we finally start putting junk mail back together. We take care of all the wiring and ignition to give it some spark.
We add a few components to help our engine and transmission stay cool. Then finish up our fuel system and exhaust, getting our DJ5 Jeep ready to fire for the first time. Hey everybody, welcome to Carcass.
We've put a ton of time into our Jeep, making it something that's off-road worthy, and that's a far cry from what it used to be, a two-wheel drive US Postal Jeep. It all started with us wanting to do a right-hand drive project, and we came across 3 US Postal Jeeps for sale. So we bought all 3 and brought them back to the shop. After choosing which one was the best one, we started tearing it apart to make room for some upgrades. We cleaned up the old frame, removing the old leaf springs and mounts. Then we went to a salvage yard and grabbed a set of 1-ton axles, and after cleaning them up, we added new gears and lockers, making our axles pretty much bomb-proof. And we also fabricated a 4-link suspension with some good coilover shocks.
Next, we dropped in a drivetrain and added a 4-to-1 transfer case, making our Jeep 4-wheel drive. After dropping the body back on, we made a few modifications to make room for our off-road chassis. The interior got an overhaul as well, adding a roll cage for safety. With all that done, it was time to take it all apart and start prepping the body and chassis for some paint. For our paint, we went with a familiar theme common to US postal vehicles, the old red, white, and blue. As for our chassis, we finished welding all of our suspension brackets and gave it a quick cleaning. To protect all of our work, we hit it with a fresh coat of paint. And that brings us to how junk mail is sitting right now. We've got a ton of stuff that we want to take care of today because we want to get this thing fired up. We've got an entire fuel system to run, a cooling system to plumb in, and a mess of wiring to straighten out. And that's exactly where we're going to start. Now on the wiring side, we're going to be doing some of the basics. We're going to be installing a new starter and a new alternator. But on the ignition side, we went to Holley Performance and picked up an MSD Digital 6 off-road box. This is fully potted so it can withstand high vibrations and wet conditions. It'll give us crisp, clean throttle response at low RPM, which is great for rock crawling, and it's selectable between 4, 6, and 8 cylinders. And since our Jeep's got that iconic 6-cylinder in it, well, this thing's gonna work perfect. Now, what I gotta do is just figure out where I'm gonna put this thing. Over at the Jeep, we got a couple options where we can mount the box. We can either put it outside in the engine compartment, or we got a better solution. We can come inside here, set it up on the firewall. That way we can read the display and make adjustments if we have to. Once we have our location, I'll mark our holes using a punch and drill them out. Then we can add our mounting hardware and screw it into place. Using a hole saw, I'll drill out the firewall, making room for our wiring harness. And plug in our connections. Next, I'll drop in our Duralast starter. It's an OEM replacement and bolts right in. For our charging system, we're going to be bolting up a Duralast alternator that we got from AutoZone, and it bolts right on to the stock bracket. With that in place, we can add our new belt and tighten everything up. Another thing we wanted to install was a new set of gauges, because we want to make sure we watch all the vital signs of our newly rebuilt engine. The gauges we got are super easy to install and fit perfectly into the existing holes in our dash. I'll feed the temp sensor through the hole in our firewall we made earlier and screw it into our freshened up engine. To finish up our electrical, I'll drop in a new Duralast battery. Then we'll bolt up our starter solenoid and connect all of our wiring. When out on the trails, you want to keep everything cool. We make a few modifications to accommodate a new radiator and a transcooler.
Now it's time to start on our cooling system. We're going with this aftermarket aluminum radiator we got from Summit Racing. It's very similar in size with the inlet and outlet locations close to the original radiator. We're doing this because we didn't have any luck finding a stock radiator for a DJ5, and the two radiators we had from our parts Jeeps were in really poor shape. But mounting something like this doesn't come without its own set of issues. So we got to try and sink this thing into the grill shell, and that's where we're going to start. Using a scribe, I'll make a few marks where I need to make my cut. To make this cut, I'll be using a cutoff wheel, being very careful to follow my mark as close as possible. Once it's cut, we drop in our new radiator and mark our new mounting holes. I got a mark and drill right there and right here. Now we can drill the holes. Then I'll measure. That's 1 3/4 offset. Cut. Bend. Drill a few holes. And mount our new brackets. Now that I know our brackets work, there's one more thing I have to take care of. Because the radiator is pushed into the grill shell, the filler neck is kind of shrouded by the grill shell itself. So we have to make some clearance for it. And what I'm going to do is take some tape and put it on the paint to protect it, and then I'll use a hole saw to cut it out. With our hole finished, I'll clean it up with a cutoff wheel and make our edges smooth using a flap wheel. Now we're ready to pull off the tape and install our radiator for the final time. Put it in for the last time. Oh yeah. We got our cooling system pretty much wrapped up. The only thing I still have to do is loop the heater hose inlet and outlet and then put some coolant in it when it comes time to fire this thing up.
With Jimmy having the cooling system buttoned up underneath the hood, there is one more thing that we want to keep cool, and that's our transmission. Now, with low-speed driving and rock crawling, transmissions have a tendency of heating up. So we went to Summit Racing and picked up a standalone transmission cooler. We're running out of room underneath the hood to put this thing, so we got to come up with a different solution. And I think I know exactly where I want to put it, and that's underneath the truck. Underneath our Jeep, we have two cross members that this lands on almost perfectly. Puts the cooler out of the way of the suspension travel, and it'll be a quick run for the cooler lines up to the transmission. I'll hold it in place using some locking pliers. Then we can drill out our holes and bolt it up to the chassis. Once secure, I'll hook up our lines to our cooler as well as our transmission. Right as rain.
If it doesn't run, we can't have any fun. We tackle our fuel system to get junk mail ready to breathe again.
With the wiring and the cooling system taken care of, there are a couple things we have to do before we can fire up the Jeep, and one of those is the fuel system.
And part of that is the fuel cell. The stock tank in this Jeep was up under the cab, but because of our axle and suspension, it's not going to fit. So we're going to put it behind the seats in the cab.
And the other half of that is underneath the hood. So I'm going to be working on the intake and the exhaust manifold. We'll slap a carburetor on top of that, and we'll start running some fuel lines.
For our fuel system, we're going with an RCI 15-gallon aluminum fuel cell that we got from Summit Racing. And to get the fuel to the front, we've got Earl's Vapor Guard hose. And to feed our 6-cylinder engine, we have a 450 CFM carburetor from Quick Fuel Technologies. To get this whole thing started, I got to find a way to mount the fuel cell. To mount the fuel cell, I'm going to run a couple straps from this cover over the top of the tank around to the floor, and I'll secure it with a couple screws. And I'm going to make these out of aluminum to try to change it up a little bit. So all I really have to do is measure, bend the straps, and drill a couple holes. Nine and a half. With our measurements and the aluminum straps marked, I'll head over to the bandsaw and cut them out. Using a brake, I'll make sure our straps are square and make a few 90-degree bends. Now it's time to drill out our holes. I'll round off the edges over at the belt sander. With that done, we can install them in our Jeep. To make it easier to locate the screws, I'll drill a few pilot holes and attach it using some self-tapping screws and a piece of foam to help keep tension on the strap. With our fuel cell installed, I have just a couple things left to do. I'm going to drill a couple holes in this panel and install some grommets. Then I'm going to run one line out the back for a vent and run the other line up to the front for the fuel pump. To make our holes, I'm using a 1 1/4 inch hole saw. With our holes cut, I can add our grommets, install the fuel hose, and tighten it down. Now I can run the hose from our tank up to the engine bay. All right, now the last thing, replace the old fuel pump with a new one. Our old fuel pump would probably work, but since we have a fresh engine and all new parts, it's a good idea to go ahead and update this as well. Before installing our new pump, I need to remove what's left of the old gasket using a razor blade. With our new pump ready to install, I'll add a new gasket. It's also a good idea to add some gasket maker to the engine block to make sure we don't have any oil leaks. Now we can install our new fuel pump and bolt it down. Last thing I need to do is install the fuel hose from our tank and tighten it.
With Jimmy taking care of the fuel system in the back, I'm going to start in the engine bay. Now the intake and exhaust manifold share the same mounting points on the cylinder head, so we have to put them on in pairs. What I'm going to start with is a fresh gasket, then we'll bolt up the exhaust manifold with a couple bolts, and we'll move on to the intake. Before we install our intake, we're going to add a little gasket maker to make sure our seal is nice and tight. All right, now we'll bolt it up. With the intake and exhaust manifold on, we'll add our ARP bolts and grab our torque wrench to tighten them up. We're using our Matco Tools 3/8 drive fixed head electronic torque wrench. It's easy to use and simple to set up. Just dial in your setting. For us, we need 23 foot-pounds. It has 4 torque alert modes and an LCD display. So when you land on your torque spec, the LED changes, you hear a beep, and the handle vibrates. It only needs 5 degrees of swing to grab the next tooth, and it's fully programmable. It also has an angle feature for those times when you need to add a degree of rotation to your bolt after you reach your torque spec. With our intake on, we'll add a gasket and a spacer. All right, let's throw this carburetor on here. With our carburetor installed, I'll go ahead and snug it down. The fuel lines go on next and get fastened. With our hoses attached to the carb, we can now run our new lines over to the pump that Jimmy installed. All right, well that takes care of the fuel system. There's still a couple more things underneath the hood we gotta take care of before we fire this thing up. We build a custom exhaust, then it's time to light the fires on junk mail.
We're getting really close. I'm gonna go grab a couple more parts so we can finish it.
Sounds good. With the wiring, the fuel, and the cooling system taken care of, we're almost ready to fire up Project Junk Mail, but there is one more thing we have to do, and that's the exhaust. Now, we can't run a traditional exhaust system underneath the Jeep because our upper 4-link bars are in the way, but we do have a solution. The plan is to run our exhaust out the passenger side, and then we'll just end it underneath the floorboard. Now, there is one piece I do have to make, and that's down here on the manifold. To make our exhaust, I have to flare one end to match the bevel on our manifold. Well, that's about 45 degrees, so I'm gonna grab some tubing and head over to the machine. Using a piece of 2-inch tube, I'll use a female ball socket to match the taper of our exhaust manifold, followed by a flare flange to finish it up. Since we have a tight turn, I'll need to cut it. Yep, that fits perfectly. To finish the downpipe, I'll grab another piece of 2-inch tube that has a 90-degree bend in it and swage one end to step it up to 2 1/4 inches. I'll take the pieces over to the table and TIG them together. All right, now we'll just throw this 45 on here. That gets us under the floor. Then we'll just add a muffler. With our downpipe in place, I'll tack in our 45, the muffler, and the exhaust tip. Now we'll just take it off, weld it up on the table. To finish welding our exhaust, I'll be using the MIG welder. All right, let's get this thing in here so we can fire this thing up.
At this point, our exhaust is all wrapped up and looking real nice. So now all we gotta do is top off the fluids like fuel, power steering, transmission, and coolant before firing up junk mail for the first time.
Okay, so all the fluids are in it. We did prime it a little bit because we got fuel pressure. I think it should start right up.
Let's hear it.
Here we go. Oh, there it is. It's got a good sound. We're super close to hitting the trails now. We still have some stuff to do yet. We got brakes to do, drive shafts, and we still got to button up all the interiors.
Hell yeah. But that's it for this episode. So if you like anything that you've seen, go to PowerNationTV.com. Fire this thing up. We'll check ATF.
Yeah, we'll check that one more time. That does run good. I purred like a kid, man.
Today on Carcass, we put the finishing touches on junk mail. We address the last pieces of our interior on our 1978 DJ5.
Plus, figure out how we're gonna shift the transmission and transfer case. Then we install our brake lines and head out on the trail to see if our old postal Jeep truly can deliver the goods. Hey everybody, welcome to Carcass. Our Jeep that we're calling junk mail has made a huge transformation from the two-wheel drive Jeep that originally rolled into the shop into this four-wheel drive off-road rig.
And it all started with the 1978 postal Jeep that originally had a 4-cylinder engine in it. But because we bought 3 Jeeps, we had the option of putting a 6-cylinder in here, along with a custom 4-link suspension, 1-ton axles, coilover shocks, a roll cage for safety, and some fresh coats of paint.
And today is the day that we get to take this thing out, but we got a couple of things that we got to do. We got to wrap up the brakes, install the complete interior, add some shifters, then we're going to throw in the drive shafts, load this thing up, and go have some fun.
Let's start on the interior.
Sounds good.
For our seat situation, we're going to be pretty resourceful. We found a matching pair of seats from the other 2 Jeeps that we bought, so that's what we'll use. This particular seat is looking pretty weathered, and we do have a way to fix that later. As far as mounting it goes, it's really simple. There are still holes in the floor for the rear part of the bracket, but because we replaced the floor pans, we're going to have to drill 2 new holes for the front part, and that's where we'll start. I'll line up the rear brackets with the existing holes so that I can mark the front mounting holes. Once marked, I'll remove the seat and drill the holes using a Matco Hyperstep drill bit. Now I can install the seat and snug it down.
Now that Jimmy has the driver's seat installed, it's time for me to hop in and take care of the shifters. For the transmission, we're going to be running the stock one. For the transfer case, we went to Summit Racing and picked up a KRC shifter. Now, if you guys remember, the original floor had a small little transmission hump in it, and now it's completely flat. So to install this shifter, we got to make a small little modification. Using a straight edge, I'll mark a line across the bracket. Then I'll use a cutoff wheel to make a relief cut. I'll bend the tab up to 90 degrees and finish it by welding it up. Back over at the Jeep, we need to cut a hole in the floor for the shifter arm to go through. Now, I already went underneath and I found out I got to come over 23.5 inches and forward about 16 inches. So we're going to put a little mark on the floor and then we'll just get to cutting. With it marked, I'll draw a line to mark the slot we need to cut out. Drill a few holes, and then connect the dots using a Benchmark Abrasives premium cutoff wheel. With our shifter in place, we need to find a way to connect that to the transmission. Now, the idea is to use a piece of solid stock, but we can't do it in a straight run because the new transmission crossmember we built is in the way. So the plan here is to use a piece of TIG rod, and we're gonna feed it up where it needs to be and add some specific bends to it so we can get our shape. Then, all I need to do is transfer this over to our piece of solid stock on the table. We'll match the bends. We'll come back and do a test fit. Using a piece of 3/8 stock, I'll use my template to mark where my bends should be. Then, using a torch, I'll heat up the area to cherry red, place it into the jig, and use a little bit of muscle to make the bend. I'll use the same process on the other end. Yeah, it's pretty close. See how it fits. All right, let's see how this works. Then from here, if we're right, we can drill some holes, install the shifter. Yeah, that'll work perfectly. With the holes marked, I'll drill them out. Drop in our shifter and tighten it down. Now we can install our linkage for our transmission. All right, let's try this. Reverse, neutral, drive, second, first. Perfect. Now we'll move on to the transfer case. With the location set, we can drill and cut the floor, just like we did with the other shifter. With the shifter body installed, we'll slide underneath the body and bolt up our handle. After a quick test run, it's time to mount the transfer case linkage. All right, shifters are installed and it's time to button up the interior, but before we get onto that, I want to throw a fresh coat of paint on this one. We'll show you a quick and easy way to update your seats.
Plus, install some stopping power for junk mail.
With the shifters installed, we also threw in the set of seats that we got from our donor vehicles. And like Jimmy said, these things are a little worse for wear and we want to put a set of seat covers on them. The only issue was we had no idea what they originally came out of. But as we were pulling them apart to clean up all the brackets, we noticed on the back of one of these covers was a little Ford insignia and a 7-digit part number. Well, armed with that information, we went to the internet and turns out we have a set of seats from a 1983 Ford Mustang. We took that information and headed over to Covercraft, and they confirmed we truly do have Mustang seats. So we ordered up a set of Carhartt-style precision-fit seat covers, and these things should work perfect in junk mail. Carhartt fabric is the perfect choice for protecting our seats from water, mud, grease, oil, and dirt. They're crafted and sewn from the highest quality duck weave water-resistant material, which makes it easy to clean and will hold up against anything we can toss its way. It has a classic Carhartt styling, and they're made to perfectly fit around our seats. They also have a foam backing for added comfort. These Covercraft Precision Fit Carhartt custom seat covers are perfect if you have children, pets, work in construction, or just love the outdoors. They're great in cold and hot climates as it maintains an even temperature, and it comes with a 3-year warranty.
With Jeremy wrapping up the interior, we can move on to the brake system. It all starts with this master cylinder that we got from Summit Racing, and then we can move on to some lines. With our master cylinder installed, we can start bending our lines. It's a good idea to put a few coils in the brake line as this provides some strain relief. The body and chassis can shift relative to one another, which can stress the brake lines. All right, that's looking pretty good. Just got to connect it to our other brake line. We ordered brake lines from Summit Racing for a Ford truck which would have a 6 to 8 inch lift. This gives us the extra length we need for our suspension to articulate. That wraps up the front brakes, so we'll finish the rears, bleed them, we'll be ready to go.
To make it move, we'll need some drive shafts, then add a few more components so we can hit the trails. All right, try that, Jimmy. How do the brakes feel?
Yeah, that's a good pedal.
Perfect. Well, now that the brakes are taken care of, we still got a couple more things we got to do. We got to throw the drive shafts in it, then we're going to install the bump stops, and we'll move on to those limit straps. Now for our drive shafts, we went to Tom Wood's custom drive shafts so they could build us a set for our Jeep. Now you guys know we have a fully custom suspension, updated powertrain, and 1-ton axles. We wanted to make sure we had a set of drive shafts that would hold up to our 37-inch tall tires and the abuse this thing's going to see when it's out on the trails. Now the drive shafts that they sent us utilize a double cardan style joint on the transfer case side. What that does is allows us to reach full suspension travel and get all of our articulation out of our drive shafts when we're out on the trails. For the bolts, we're going to be using ARP bolts, and we'll add a little bit of thread locker. When measuring for drive shafts, you want to make sure your vehicle is at ride height. Also, you'll need to know what series U-joint fits your pinion, as well as the angle of the drive shaft. All right, let's get the front one in. Sweet. If you roll that in underneath here, we'll pick this up, we'll check for flex, check for binding, and then we can check for the bump stops as well.
Let's see how it does.
That's good right there, actually. Yeah, that'll work. Go ahead. I'm gonna take a look at the drive shaft. Make sure it doesn't touch anything. Keep going. Keep going, stop there. Okay, so that's about a finger width between the drive shaft and the upper four-link mount.
That's impressive.
Yeah, so I think we're good there to probably take a measurement for the bump.
Okay.
It's probably safer for you to take that measurement.
Yeah.
You're on that side. Just see what it reads from the chassis to that axle truss.
Like 5.5.
Okay. And our bumps are like 4 3/4 or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Do some math, we'll figure out what we got to do there. We'll build a bracket and we'll get set up.
Yeah.
Sounds good. You go back down with this just to make it safe. And I'll watch. Just straighten the tire back out. There you go. Perfect, that'll work.
The most important part of mounting our bump stop is to mount it close enough to the axle housing so it's functional. So my idea here is to take a piece of 1/4-inch plate, put a couple bends in it, that way it's offset from the chassis rail. So that starts with cutting our 1/4-inch piece of plate to length. With our measurement made, I can head over to the iron worker and cut out our piece. Then use the horizontal brake to make our bends. I'll do 2 45-degree bends on each side and punch some holes for a rosette weld on each end. Back at the fab table, I can drill our mounting hole. Then head over to the chassis to prep the area for welding and install our bracket. With the bracket fully welded, I'll do one final check before painting it and final install.
Now, one last thing to go along with our bump stops are limit straps. And one thing to remember is that these things are gonna stretch out about 1 inch over the course of its lifetime per 12 inches of strap. So that's one thing to consider when you guys take your measurements and order these things up. Now what I gotta do is install these things, and then we're gonna go hit the trails.
we head to the trails to see if junk mail has first-class performance. All right, it's finally time. We're out here at Adventure Off-Road Park. We have almost 600 acres and over 120 trails to choose from.
And the trail system here at AOP ranges from anything from mild to wild, stuff like your side-by-sides or your weekend warriors, all the way up to like Project Junk Mail and some rock bouncers. But today is the day we're gonna see if junk mail truly can deliver.
Let's do it.
Let's go.
I'm excited.
This will be fun.
All right, we'll start it off a little easy.
This shouldn't be too bad. Should be kind of fun to see how it handles, really.
Yeah.
The best part is we don't have doors,
Right.
so we can just stick our heads out. This ain't nothing.
No, they can do a lot more than this.
Yeah, totally. This is George Winter Trail. Let's run this one. This will be a little tougher.
All right.
This is one of my favorites up here at the top. I don't think we'll have our work cut out for us, but it's gonna be a little more difficult.
Yeah. It's just rocks.
Using the throttle a little bit, bud. Just crawling. Man, it's like we're not doing anything.
No.
This thing's doing great.
Just let it cruise a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, I'm truly impressed right now.
I am too.
This thing is crazy. It's not even struggling.
Nope.
It's not even struggling. Like we're just cruising away, delivering the mail. All right, let's, I'm gonna spot you now.
Okay.
Then we'll just start placing tires in right spots and then we'll get up this. Not that we need it, we're doing really good, but.
Yeah.
So hard driver. Okay, like that. Yep. Yep. Perfect. All right, I gotta know. What do you think?
It's awesome.
This is like your first time out, so.
Yeah, first time off-road, and like it's kind of sketchy, but like addicting at the same time.
Cool, I think we should keep going. It's like kind of downhill from here.
Yeah.
We'll go play one more spot.
Yeah, you drive.
All right, yeah, I can drive
You
this.
got to get a feel for it.
I can drive this thing. We're going.
Check it out over here.
Yeah, let's try it this way once. Looks like we got a little bit of mud.
Yeah, not bad.
Try to play around in here. How are we looking on that rock?
Yeah, you got room.
Little body.
You got it.
Oh,
Ouch.
that's a little deeper than it looks.
Yeah.
Still not a problem. Like,
No.
that just walked right through that. No issues. Whoop, whoop, whoop. Let's go down yonder, huh? A little bit of mud on these trails.
Yeah.
Kind of fun. Something different.
A little slippery.
Yeah. We better square back up on that one. That was kind of crazy.
That was a little bit, yeah.
How about that?
Sure.
That's an easier way to get around that
Yeah.
one. Life
little
gives
more.
you lemons. Make lemonade, Jim.
Yeah. A little more mud. You know what's amazing?
What's that?
This is the first 4-link that you or I have ever built.
Right.
And it's doing pretty dang good.
I wouldn't say we're doing bad by any means.
Yeah.
I think it's performing like it should.
Yep. Oh, another frog.
Yeah, see that frog down
Yeah.
there?
Get out the way.
Watch out, froggy. We're having a little bit of fun.
Yeah, and this thing has really handled everything we've thrown at it. We've gone up some harder trails, some easier ones, mud,
Right.
a little slick rock.
Yeah, I think I'm having a blast.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun to drive. You know, the bars in the cage ended up being like perfect, exactly where we needed them.
Oh yeah. Nothing else to hold on to up here.
Right. Awesome out here though. I'll take it. All day long, I will take it. You know, the Jeep pretty much did exactly what we wanted it to do. It took us where we needed to go, but there's a couple things we could improve on.
Yeah, I think there's room for some upgrades in certain areas, but like overall, this thing has really proven itself, and we've built a pretty gnarly trail rig.
Yeah, we got a little bit of daylight left, so I think we should go have some fun.
Yeah.
If you guys like anything you've seen on the show today, why don't you go to PowerNationTV.com, and Jimmy and I will see you next time.
And we're gonna hit some more trails in the meantime.
Yeah, this'll be a little bit of fun. I think we got like, 5-8 gallons of gas left.
A couple hours of daylight.
Couple hours of daylight. Today on Carcass, junk mail was such a blast that we had to bring it back. We have a few more goodies to add, making it the ultimate wheeler.
We also fabricate some new doors for added safety on the trails, and then take it out for some more adventures. What's up everybody? Welcome to Carcass. Today we've got Project Junk Mail, our 1978 DJ5 Jeep back in the shop. And this thing started out on a down on its luck mail delivery vehicle, and we've turned it into this. After we stripped it down to just the frame rails, we got to work. We built our very own 4-link suspension, assembled a set of 1-ton axles, dropped in the freshly rebuilt drivetrain, and we rounded that all off with a paint scheme that paid tribute to the male Jeep's roots. Then we headed out to put all of our hard work to the test.
And today, it's all about improvements. You know, when you build a rig like this, you just build with the money that you have available. And then when you gain a little bit more money, like when that stimulus check hits, you can rush out and support the economy and buy some Jeep parts, throw it at your trail rig. That's what we're gonna be doing today. So we're gonna convert this thing into fuel injection, take care of some steering upgrades, and build a set of custom tube doors to help us feel a little bit safer when we're out on the trails. And Jimmy, let's get started.
Let's do it.
For the fuel injection setup underneath the hood of our Jeep, we went with an EFI master kit that we picked up from Phytech. Comes with everything you need to install it underneath the hood. You've got some hoses and some fittings, a little fuel filter here. You've got your handheld controller that helps you watch your vital signs, and your throttle body setup. Now, we went with the Go Street 400 horsepower throttle body, and it works well with vehicles ranging from 150 to about 400 horsepower. And since our Jeep's got about 250 horse, this thing will work perfectly. Now, another big part of their setup is their force fuel module. This works in conjunction with your factory fuel pump, and what that does is puts fuel into this module. This module converts it into enough fuel pressure to control the injectors in the throttle body, and you're all set to go. Like I said, super simple to install. Where we're gonna start is right here with the module. Okay, so to mount the module, we could go back here on the firewall, but it gets a little close to the exhaust manifold. We could go down in some of these little crevices, but it could make it hard to plumb. So we think we're gonna mount it right here on the shock hoop. Now you can mount this completely vertical or horizontal, and we're gonna go kind of halfway in between. We'll mount it right here. So all I gotta do is just make a couple mounts. We'll get this thing installed. All right, let's make our bracket about 3 1/4. Using some 1-inch flat strap, I'll cut some pieces, drill some holes, and weld it all together. All right, so now we'll just bolt these brackets onto this module, and then we'll just weld everything in the Jeep. Okay, so we'll just get this set in place here on the shock hoop, and then we'll grab the welder, weld it in. All right.
Okay, we'll get rid of a couple fuel lines, get this carburetor out of the way, and we'll set our throttle body in place. All right, now all we do is set our throttle body into place, and it bolts right up to the existing flange that the carburetor sat on. All right, so that's the two major parts of our fuel injection system installed. So now what I have to do is hook up some lines that go from the module to the throttle body, and then we'll run one from here back to the fuel cell.
For our return line, we went with braided stainless steel to give us a little more protection underneath the Jeep. With the return line installed, we'll hook up a couple quick connections. All right, one of the last things we have to do is install an oxygen sensor because our EFI needs to see an air-fuel ratio in order for it to work correctly. And Fitech sends this little adapter, so all we have to do is drill a hole into our exhaust, clamp it down with the supplied clamps, and that just means no welding involved. All right, so we don't have a lot of room down here on the exhaust because it's so short, and the idea is to stay far enough away from the manifold before we get to the muffler. And we want to put this on a flat, not any type of a curve. So I think the spot to be is going to be to install this right about there. Using a step drill, I'll drill a hole in our exhaust and install the sensor bung and our sensor. Like that. And all we have to do is just plug in the connector. All right. That wraps up everything underneath the hood. Now we'll go inside, connect the handheld, and fire this thing up. So with our handheld plugged in, I got to do the initial setup, like tell it we've got 6 cylinders, 258 cubic inches, and we'll set the idle speed to about 850. And this thing should fire right up. Like that. That's perfect. So now all we have to do is a couple more things to button this thing up, and then we're going to head right back out on the trails.
Coming up, we built some custom tube doors for junk mail, giving us some added protection. At this point, Jeremy's finished up our EFI conversion, so what I'm going to start doing is working on a set of tube doors for our Jeep. The last time when we were on the trail, we were lacking some side protection in the rare event that we tipped this thing on a rock. So what I envision here is coming off our roll cage bar with a set of hinges that make the door easily removable, come straight across, kind of contour the body, and then go back across, maybe put a plate in the center to make it look cool, and really that starts with cutting some tube. I'll start by cutting out some 1.5 DOM for the door. Then I'll cut out the chassis side of the hinges and put 2 90-degree bends in each one. All right, so I've got 1/2 of the hinges cut out and bent, and what I did was I mounted them on a piece of 3/8 rod. And what I'm doing here is just making sure that they stay in alignment when I go to tack these onto our roll cage bar. So I'll just prep this tube, place our front half hinges here, and that way I can put the other side of the hinges on this tube, hang the front tube, and then build the rest of the door from here instead of trying to float the whole door in here and then try to mount it later. So I just got to prep this and then tack. With 1/2 of the hinges tacked in, I'll mount the door side of the hinges using a couple bolts. Okay. All right, just gotta tack it. All right, it doesn't bind or anything, so we can start building doors. 29. When making tube doors like this, it's just a lot of cutting and notching until you get to the desired design that you want. All right, 2 more tubes, 1 down and 1 across, and then we'll figure out something in the middle. I just gotta make sure this tube is level with the top one, and we'll tack it in. All right, so the door is almost done, and we have 1 more tube to make. And actually on the door itself, I'm gonna put a notch in this tube going down. That way we can run a tube from up here down to here, and it'll stick out a little bit on the bottom, just like this side. All right, so we got this end fitting pretty good. The only thing now is notching this tube so that, you know, it can slide up farther and meet this one, get a good weld around it, and then we'll figure out something for the front. All right, with that tube in place, we can start working on the cover. For the door cover, we're using 1/8" plate for added protection. All right, that looks like it fits pretty good, but I'm not gonna put this on yet until I can weld the tubes all the way around. So for right now, I'm just gonna get working on the latch, and then we'll finish the door. For the latch, we're going with an AutoLoc Bear Claw that we got from Summit Racing. These are pretty universal. You can use them for a hot rod or a Jeep. And I just got to mount this one on a plate, weld it to the door itself, and then I have to make a plate to mount on the inside to mount the pin. So once that's done, this thing will be fully operational. All right, let's see. All right, so the only thing left is to weld this whole thing up and give it a fresh coat of paint.
Up next, we take our steering to the next level.
What do you think?
Dude, I love the doors.
Cool.
They work perfectly on the Jeep. So that's one thing we took care of. The other thing is we switched this over to fuel injection, so we took care of that. Now the last thing we're gonna do is some steering upgrades. Now, if we ever move over to a bigger set of wheels and tires, it's a good idea for us to do some steering work. So we're gonna be moving away from the hydro-assisted steering and go to a full hydro setup.
And something that you get with a 4-link and crossover steering setup is bump steer. And inherently, bump steer isn't a problem, especially in a rock crawling situation, because you're going so slow that you have full control over your vehicle. But if we were to take something like this down the highway, that can quickly turn into a dangerous situation. So full hydraulic steering eliminates bump steer. And like you said, if we want to go to a bigger set of wheels and tires, that will eliminate any potential issues.
Now we already have PSC steering underneath the Jeep, so a lot of the parts underneath the hood are interchangeable. So it's just an easy solution to use PSC again. But what I do have to do is get rid of this assisted ram down here in the gearbox, and then we have to go to the full hydro ram, and you have a solution on how to mount that, right?
Yep, I'm gonna cut it on the plasma table.
Cool, well I'm gonna go grab some tools and I'm gonna start getting rid of some parts.
All right.
We'll loosen up some of the fittings on the hydraulic ram to get them out of the way. Then we'll get started on the drag link and the tie rod bar.
Now we can get the gearbox out of the way. Get this heavy thing out of the way.
All right, so while Jeremy's been taking apart the Jeep, I've been designing the bracket for our hydraulic cylinder. So I'll cut it out on the table here, take it over to the Jeep, tack it on, and see if we can make this thing work. For our cylinder bracket, we're using 1/4" steel to make sure this thing stays where we want it to. Once it's cut out, I'll grind the paint off the axle and start tacking the pieces into place.
Now the hydraulic assisted steering we had underneath the Jeep used this smaller cylinder in conjunction with our steering gearbox. But now that we're going to this full hydro setup, we're going to be using a 2.5" bore 8" stroke cylinder, and that works in conjunction with this orbital. Now this is kind of the brains of the operation. It accepts the input from our steering wheel and turns it into a hydraulic pressure, and that moves the ram to the left and to the right. Now we got all of this from PSC, and it came as a kit, everything from our fluid, hoses and fittings, and it even came with all of our steering. Now Jimmy's already got the mount made for the cylinder, so that's where we're going to start. Wow, perfect timing, Jimmy. You ready for the cylinder?
Yeah, let's get it in there, at least tack it.
Hold it up here for you.
All right, ready?
Yeah, that looks close.
With the mounting blocks tacked in, we'll remove the hydraulic cylinder and permanently weld everything up. Then finish it off with a couple coats of paint.
That looks pretty good.
Thanks, yeah. I already took some measurements for the tie rods, so I'm gonna go get to making those. It looks like you're gonna mount that.
Yeah, I'll set the orbital up here. I think it's gonna go up on the inside chassis rail, so.
Sweet.
We'll get that in there somehow.
I'll let you get to it.
And so I'll set the orbital up here on the inside of the frame rail. So I just gotta kind of mark it. We'll grind all this paint off. We'll tack the bracket in.
We'll throw on a couple tacks to start, then fully weld it up and paint it to match. We'll install our orbital, hook up our steering, and connect our hydraulic lines.
All right, dude, I got some tie rods for you.
Perfect. I'll get those installed and then just top the whole system off with fluid.
Sweet, and I'm gonna bend up a skid plate so we can protect everything we just did, and then we'll be ready to hit the trails.
Sounds awesome.
With all of our new additions, we take junk mail back to the proving grounds. All right, everybody, we're back out here at Adventure Off-Road Park for the second test of our Jeep. We've got full hydraulic steering on this thing now, a couple other upgrades, EFI, and we got some doors on it to give us a little more confidence. And honestly, any day that we can get out of the shop, it's good for us to take. So let's see what we can do.
Yeah, let's have some fun, right?
Yeah.
So there wasn't anything wrong with the Jeep before, but you know, you can always do improvements, right?
Yeah.
Or not improvements, I think upgrades is a better term there.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of natural going from a box setup with a, you know, ram assist to a full hydro. That's just what you would do if you're trying to get a little bit more out of your rig.
Right, right.
So, I mean, so far this thing, like, it's just a little easier to drive probably.
Yeah, 100%. We're gonna take it out of gear. We're just gonna let the gravity do our thing right now, because she's a little slick out here yet.
Yeah.
Look at that. Again, no issues, just
walk in the park, man. Walk in the park. And here, look at this super tight turning. And it just, whoop, right around. Dude, that's just good old-fashioned fun right there.
And EFI too, like there's ways to get a carburetor to work off-road with the weird angles and stuff, but it's just get in this thing, turn the key, and you're gone.
Right. And I'm barely touching the gas. Like the idle's not searching.
Yeah.
It's just solid steady. It's at 884 RPM.
Yeah. And no hesitations.
Right.
You know?
Just walking. You know, you really couldn't ask for a better day.
Nope.
Not to be outside wheeling, that's for sure.
Yeah, shaded by the trees.
Right. I mean, AOP is such a great place to come anyways.
Yeah, there's a lot of different terrain. Really, there's something for whatever rig you got.
Right. You know, this is different than what we did last time. We're in the same park, and yet it's different, which is just nuts. Like a little tricky here. Let's see what happens. All right, that's all that took.
Yeah.
Oh, I spoke too soon.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just like that.
There you go.
Oh, simple enough. Now let's try this one.
Yeah.
God, this may be a little trickier because we got wet tires now.
Yeah.
So we want to go forward.
Go forward, yeah. Go, 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 yeah!
Good frickin' spotting, man.
Yeah.
That was perfect. Dude, we sat, that was 45 degrees at least. That was a heck of an incline.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, that's good right there.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, body damage. Whoops, whoops.
Little tree rash, all right.
My bad, my bad.
You can't ask for much more than that. And if you guys want to see more of what we're doing, go to PowerNationTV.com and be sure to check out our build pages where you can see the square body tow truck, the Rally Honda, and more of this Jeep.
We're super close to the truck, but I say we hit a couple more trails and then we can call it a day.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because you know it is doing exactly what we wanted to do right now.
Yeah.
Just creepy crawling through the woods.